Good morning, good afternoon, wherever the share finds you. We're speaking about the Parsha B'Shalach, and the context about we're going to speak is we're going to speak about the pasuk in Shemais 15:22, and specifically the Rashi over there. What happens? The Bnei Israel have crossed the Red Sea. The Egyptians are rushing after them. The sea closes over the Egyptian pursuers, and all the adornments which the Egyptian pursuers had, that is, the gold, silver, and precious stones that the Egyptian cavalry had, became washed up on the shore, and the Jewish people remained there to collect the spoils. Now, the verse talks and says that 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 Moshe led away the people from the Red Sea. And Rashi makes the interesting comment based on a Mechilta that he says that he led them away against their will, bar kocha, against their will. So you can look up the text. It's Pasuk 15:22. We understand it's Bakorcha because of the word says V'yiso, and they traveled. He made them travel. So our question, what we're going to understand, try to understand, is simply why were they collecting all the booty? Because at the time of the splitting of the Red Sea, the people of the Bnei Israel had already experienced unparalleled divine miracles. They were able to say at the time of the crossing of the Red Sea, they could say, "Zeh Keli B'Yanveyu," this is my God, and they were also en route to receiving the Torah at Sinai. Because they were so enthusiastic and so embedded with so much intense divine awareness that it says that even most simplest of the people could see godliness. Even the babies in the mother's stomachs were aware of the divinity that was floating around. How come they were so distracted by the bounty which was on the cavalry of the Egyptians, and they were collecting it to the point that Moshe had to forcibly tear the Bnei Israel away from the shoreline. So our explanation refers back to the original prophecy that Avram was given, that Abraham, our forefather, was given. Avram was promised that although his children would be enslaved in a foreign land, they would leave with Barichush Godol, with a great treasure. That's written in Genesis and Bereshit 12:14. And that's what happened. The Jews, when they left Egypt, they took with them all the all the bounty, all the riches of Egypt. And what they took with them, they had the idea that all of these riches were for them to use in spiritual endeavors in their future. So that they had all of this was in their minds, that they were um, at the time when they had come for their leaving Egypt. God had commanded, as I said, um, that they asked their neighbors for all their gold and silver, they were given, which the Egyptians gave them, and they emptied Egypt like and left it as a sea without fish. That's what the Gemara mentions, that they emptied Egypt like a sea without fish. Um, Thus, the Jewish people were commanded, and they understood that this was part of the divine promise that Abraham was given, right from the beginning, that they would leave with the great wealth. So the impression that this opportunity presented itself, that they could take possession of Egypt's wealth whenever an opportunity for that it presented itself, that requirement seemed to be part of the idea that at the time of the great miracle of crossing the Red Sea and finding all the great treasures which the Egyptian cavalry had with them, that they experienced this fervor to complete Hashem's promise in a highest level, that they wanted to fulfill this command. So when Moshe informed them that the time had come to continue on, even though there was wealth that remained at the shore, the people understood that the command which they were originally given in Egypt, that they had to, and as part of the fulfillment of the promise, that had to empty out Egypt from all their possessions. They thought that applied to the cavalry and all the wealth which they found now at the seashore. And they thought that that was a continuous mitzvah, continuous commandment. So, so at that point, they were full of that fervor of continue or wanting to continue that mitzvah. So, but now Moshe has informed them that the time has come to move on. But to their understanding, to the Bnei Yisrael's understanding, to their spiritual instinct, moving on and going to the next stage was against their will. They were being forced to do it. They wanted to still be involved in the previous commandments of Hashem, the requirement of Isnatzlu to clean out, to empty out the Egyptians of all the wealth. Understandably and rationally, they might have understood that God's will had now moved to another phase to achieve another goal. But in order to do that, they had to tear themselves away from their previous attachment and emotional understanding and spiritual investment of what they were doing, that they had so completely dedicated themselves to fulfilling God's will. They understood that their requirement was to gather up all the objects which had the sparks of holiness in them, those precious objects, the gold and silver, clothing, which existed in Egypt and existed with the Egyptian people, and all those deep spiritual sparks had to come into the realm of a Jew and had to be elevated. But now they were being told, and in fact, it was against their will, that they had to move on to a more deeper, higher level of service and to move on from that. And they were resistant. And that's why the verse says that Moshe had to move them on. He forced them against their will. By possessing as much of Egypt's wealth as possible, the Jewish people were ultimately elevating the divine sparks, which had already been collected in Egypt from Joseph's time. That's why there had to be, as part of this idea, it had to be the spiritual descent of the Jews into Egypt and the famine in Egypt, so that all the wealth would come into the Egyptian land, so that eventually in time, in a time of the future, they would be able to possess all of that and elevate that. So by possessing as much of Egypt's wealth as possible, the Jewish people were actually elevating all those divine sparks that's embedded within those material possessions. And ultimately, this is the divine plan behind the exile and the Exodus. For the Jewish people had to wrestle with the lowest parts of the material world that's involved in the Egyptian empire and extract its spiritual potential and elevate the material reality to God's realm. So the people were very preoccupied with collecting those Egyptian spoils, that booty, because this is the ultimate purpose of them of that national pain that they had gone through to transform all the all of Egyptians' collected entities and elevate them in some sort of way to godliness, eventually to be used in the temple, in the Mikdash. So when Moshe told them to leave the seaside, they understood rationally that God wanted them to move on to receive the Torah. But it was very hard for them to rip up their emotions, their emotional involvement. They were so invested in the spiritual work of transformation, they had to actually tear themselves to the point where they had to be forced and move in order to prepare for their next phase, the next task that they were going to that they were moving on to. Now, the Rebbe has taught us that this is a lesson in life. Some of us are called on sometimes to work with the material world and to be involved revealing the godliness with it, and others are told to work within the realm of spirituality and Torah. Some people are involved in business, and some people are involved in study of the Torah. And even though everybody has to engage in both of those tasks, where a person has a primary task. And when we're engaged in one sphere, we must be very dedicated and focused on what we're supposed to do. But when the time comes to begin work in the other sphere, it feels like we have to tear ourselves away against our will. We might be working at our day job and involving ourselves and becoming quite consumed in the energy and the passion of that job. Yet when it comes time to go to the next phase of the Jew's life, when he comes home from work and then goes to the base of Medrash, he goes to his place of study, he has to tear himself away from that endeavor and put that same energies into the new task, which might be learning in the base of Medrash or doing all what's necessary for the family that's necessary at home, but from the spiritual aspect. And so that we have to force ourselves to move from one phase to the next phase, so that when we move on from one phase to the next phase, we have to take this on like it's our full life and passion. And secondly, if as the Jewish people were so fanatically preoccupied with elevating the peaks of material object, they did not want to leave any potential spark untouched. That's why they were going through all that spoil and trying to collect all that spoil. So if that's how they were doing it, how much more so that we must, in our work, whether it's our work in our day job or in our work with the material world, or whether it's our work with other Jews, that we must do it passionately and strongly and to make sure that we pull out everything. But when we need to move on to that other phase, right, we need to take that on as well with the same life and passion, knowing that's all part of our work that we have to do. When we're in something, we do it with a very strong passion. When we move to that next sphere, we also have to put that same passion into it, realizing this is all part of the role that Hashem has given us to elevate the world and to elevate this particular sparks in this aspect of the world, whether it be the world of materialism or the world of Torah. We have to elevate the special sparks which are in there and elevate them and bring them to Hashem. So I wish you all a very good week, and I hope you enjoyed this class.